Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of The Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are talking about using hypotheses in your genealogy and family history research. Now, for those of you who are beginners to family history, that may seem like a super sciencey word, but hopefully it's something that will make more sense to you as we go on. For those of you who have been doing family history research for a really long time, this may be something that you do so naturally that it just comes second nature to you. So you may not even realize that's what you're doing, but I think by articulating the concept and maybe diving into it just a little bit more, it'll help us refine our processes and become better researchers. Now, let me just tell you a little bit about one of the places where this comes from. So Ancestry is currently one of the sponsors for the new Disney Pixar movie Coco. And I had the opportunity last week to go to a screening of that event or of that movie, and then we had a little after party afterwards. And a lot of the influencers that were there, you know, some of the Mouseketeers and people in the Disney universe came to us. Ancestry had a bunch of researchers there, and we helped them look up their family history. And this is a scenario that plays out a lot in my professional life because I do a lot of events kind of similar to this, where we're introducing a brand new audience to genealogy and family history. And they'll come up to me and I'll say, okay, tell me what you know about your parents. And they'll give me their parents' names and birth dates, and we'll enter them into a tree and start building the tree. And then I'll say, okay, well, now tell me what you know about your grandparents. And I'll get like this blank stare. And so what I found is I've learned what questions to ask to elicit the correct information. Because it's just amazing to me. I was raised in a family where we talked about family all the time, but there are people in the world who do not know who their grandparents are, don't have any concept of even the names of their great-grandparents, and they're coming into family history often. And if you're one of these people, it's easy to get overwhelmed. So the whole point today is to help you not get overwhelmed. Like I said, for those of you who are brand new to this might be kind of a new concept. But for those of you who've been doing family history for a long time, this might be a good refresher of your basic skills. So let's talk about just the basic definition of the word hypothesis. So I can't even say the word. A hypothesis is a supposition or proposed explanation made on the basis of limited evidence as a starting point for further investigation. That's just the dictionary definition of that word. Seems a little bit highfalutin. There is actually a genealogical definition. This is from the National Institute for Genealogical Studies. They have an article out on their website called Basic Genealogy Research Plans, and this is how they define a genealogical hypothesis. A supposition, there's that word again, you develop after examining some information and considering where it will lead you for its verification or possible rejection. It involves some conscious mental work with that first information. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is how we develop those suppositions, where we get that initial first information, what conscious mental work we have to do in order to get to a point where we can allow that to lead us to verification or rejection of that information. Okay, I promise not as complicated as that maybe sounds. So let's just use a basic example, and this is an example that could have applied to any one of the people I worked with last week. It could apply to any of you who are brand new to family history. If I ask you, what was your grandmother's name, and you tell me, and then I say, okay, when was she born? Blank stares from new people sometimes. So what I've learned to do is ask the question in a different way. Is she still alive? No. Okay, when did she die? Blank stares. How old were you when she died? Oh, I was 10. Okay, now we can figure out what year it was that she died. Do you know about how old she was when she died? Oh, I think that we had just had her 85th birthday party. That is almost word for word a conversation that I had last week, because we know more than we think we know, but sometimes when we're presented with a pedigree chart or a family tree that we have to fill in the blanks of birth dates and places and death dates and places, it seems a little overwhelming to try to remember that information. But when we put it in the context of other things going on in our lives, we know more than we think we know. So now we have a basic hypothesis, which is Grandma Mary died when I was 10 years old, and she was about 85 years old at the time. Now, we can do some simple math using that hypothesis, and now we know that we can go look for a death certificate for Grandma the year that I was 10 years old. We can go look for a birth certificate for Grandma 85 years before that, and using that evidence that we start to collect, or this hypothesis leads us to collect evidence, which then can prove the hypothesis to be true or false. Does that make sense? So basically all we're doing is using the information we know, that first information, to lead us to seek out information that either proves or rejects our hypothesis. Maybe you go and you collect that information and you find out that Grandma actually died when you were 12, but you got close, and that she was actually 86 when she died. Again, you got close, but using that hypothesis is going to lead you down that road. Hopefully that makes sense, because now we're going to kick it up a level. We're going to go to kind of another way that this works. I'm just going to keep giving you some examples or summary or statement, hypothesis statements, and show you how that works in family history. So here's another concept for a hypothesis. Most people in the United States in the 1800s had their first child within 2 years of marriage. Okay, that is first information that I have gathered because I have gone out looking for that information. That is not something that I would expect everyone to know, but it is certainly information that is findable. So most people in the United States in the 1800s had their first child within 2 years of marriage. Now comes the hypothesis as it relates to my or your family history, right? Since John and Sarah, whoever John and Sarah might be, right? Since John and Sarah's oldest child was born in 1864, I'm going to be looking for a marriage record sometime between 1861 and 1863. Do you see how that works? So again, I have information, and to take the next step in my research, I need to make a hypothesis so that I know where to look for additional information that's going to prove or reject my hypothesis. Now, it could be that that oldest child in the household in 1870 isn't really their child, right? Maybe that, because remember the 1870 census does not list relationships to the people in the household. So it could just be it could be a sibling, it could be a nephew, it could be, who else knows, right? Again, you can form some hypotheses and then work to prove or reject those hypotheses. It could be that Sarah is actually wife number 2, and that oldest child is the child of John and his first wife. Maybe she died in childbirth and then John remarried, and the rest of the children are Sarah's. Okay, there are always going to be circumstances in our family history that you can't immediately account for, but you form a basic hypothesis with the information that you have available, and then you work to prove or reject that. So in this instance, if I was to go looking for a marriage record between 1861 and 1863, and I found a marriage record for John and Sarah, I've proven my hypothesis. If I was to go looking for a marriage record for John and Sarah and not be able to find it, I might have to form another hypothesis, such as maybe they were married somewhere else that I wasn't expecting, so I need to go look elsewhere. Maybe his first wife died and Sarah's the second wife, so I need to look for a marriage record for John and somebody else in that time period. Maybe I need to go back to the records for that oldest child, see if I can find evidence of who his mother was, so that I can match that up with the information that I'm searching for. So the idea is you're just formulating these hypotheses so that you know what you're looking for and so that you know where to go look for that information. Okay, let's use another example. We're going to kick it up a level here. We're going to go from basic to a little bit more intermediate. So this is actually a scenario that I am working with. I've worked with somebody on. This is not my family, but this is almost exactly the email that I received from this individual when they were requesting my help. They said, my grandfather was raised by his mother and adopted by his stepfather. So he was raised knowing that the man who he called dad was really his stepfather who had adopted him. His biological father is unknown, and his biological father was unknown to him. Mother knew who it was, refused to tell. And so grandpa was raised, with this knowledge, passed this knowledge on to his family that this man was stepfather. We took his name, we have his name, but not biological father. Grandfather's deceased, father is deceased, so granddaughter has taken an Ancestry DNA test. In her Ancestry DNA test results, in her cousin match list, she has 2 third cousin matches who do not match any of her other known lines. So they don't connect with her mother's family tree, they don't connect with her dad's other branches of his family tree. So, right, the hypothesis is that these 2 unknown third cousin matches actually connect with grandfather's biological father's family. She has, between these 2 third cousin matches, discovered who their common ancestor is. And the hypothesis is she thinks that one of the grandchildren of that couple is her grandfather's biological father. So she's formed this hypothesis based on information she has available. Now she has to work to prove or disprove that hypothesis, okay? So there are some things she could do. One is she could trace or research all of the children and grandchildren of that couple so that she knows who the candidates are. In that grandchild generation, she knows she's looking for a male because she's looking for grandfather's father. She also knows where her grandfather was born and where her grandmother or grandfather's mother lived. So you have to have people in the same approximate location in order to conceive a child. And so she's looking for males of a certain age in this generation who were in approximately the same areas that her grandmother or her grandfather's mother lived. Okay. Now, the next step to prove or disprove that hypothesis would be to see if any of those individuals' children or grandchildren are still living and could be DNA tested so that she could prove the biological connection. So you have a hypothesis and then you work to prove it or disprove it. And DNA is certainly one area where the level of evidence is a little bit more certain. Now, we still need paper trails, we still need documentation to back it up and to correlate with it, but DNA is an area where hypotheses work really well, and then you can target, test, or invite people, specific people, to DNA tests to help prove or disprove certain theories that you've developed about your family history. In this case, proving biological parentage for somebody from several generations ago. Okay, next scenario. Hopefully you're starting to understand how this works, this concept. I'll tell you right now in my research, sometimes I actually write out my hypothesis because I want to make sure I've got all the pieces, and I'll show you a more detailed example of that here in just a minute, but typically this is just something that I do in my head. But if I find myself getting a little scattered, or if I find myself not progressing in my research, I will actually write it down because that helps keep me focused and it helps clarify my thoughts in such a way that I know what the next research steps are. So here's another example. I've got a family and I'm trying to learn more about this family. William is my ancestor. I know that William was born in, excuse me, I know that William was born in 1764 based on all the evidence that I've been able to collect so far. I have found a will for his father, okay? And in that will, the father lists 7 children. My hypothesis is that the 7 children listed in this will could be listed in birth order. That's not always the case, but there are some clues that that might be the case. One of the clues is that they're actually listed in varying gender order. Sometimes you'll see like all the boys listed and then all the girls listed, or vice versa. If that's the case, this hypothesis doesn't work. But in the case of this particular will, the children are listed, in varying gender order. And so my theory is that the order that they're listed in is birth order. And since I know William was born in 1764, and since I know that in the 1700s, typically children were born about 2 years apart, I can estimate the birth years of those siblings using approximately 2 years between each. Now, why is that important? Well, William shows up pretty much in the middle, so I can estimate the birth years of the older siblings, estimate the birth years of the younger siblings. Then I have kind of a range of this family's lifespan, right? The mother dies. She's not mentioned in the will. And so what I'm actually looking for, one of the things I'm looking for is, when did the mother die? Well, now that I know about when this youngest child was born, I know mom had to be alive at least until then. And so I have a range of time when I can start looking for a death record for mom, sometime between the birth of that last child and when her husband's will was written. I now know when that oldest child approximately was born. And so now I can start looking for a marriage record for the parents in the year or two before the birth year of that oldest child. It also means I can start digging more into the lives of each of those children now that I have an approximate year of birth for each of them. Now, this is a technique that I use all the time, especially when you get back into the early 1800s, the 1700s, the 1600s, where there are not a lot of, or any, mostly birth, marriage, and death records, where census records are not readily available or existent at all. And so it helps you to start to put together the structure of a family. But you have to have that first piece of information to work off of. You can't just make wild guesses. Part of a hypothesis is you're making a supposition based on some known information. You have to be willing to let that hypothesis go if additional evidence proves that it's not true or that it's unlikely. And so if I had additional evidence come to light that, for example, maybe William's father was married multiple times, now all of a sudden I've got a whole different dynamic happening here with these children. Maybe there's a huge gap between William and his younger set of siblings because they're from a different mother, or there's lots of other things that could show up. So you have to kind of form a hypothesis to give you direction, but then allow yourself to make discoveries along the way, and don't reject evidence out of hand because it doesn't fit this predetermined idea that you have in your head. Okay, let's move on. So this is a more detailed example, and this is an example of an actual family history hypothesis that I worked with in my own family history for years to prove, and we've actually finally proven it. Maybe I'll do a whole video on that someday to give you all the evidence. But basically, I have I think she's a 5 times great-grandmother who was from England and ended up in jail at the age of 18. And when she was 19 years old, she was convicted to 14 years service in the colonies. And so she was shipped over to the colonies, and Tobias Phillips, who was a tobacco farmer from Richmond, Virginia, came all the way up to Maryland to purchase some slaves and some indentured servants, and he purchased Margaret's indentureship in 1730, and it was a 14-year service, which seems super excessive because she stole some bread because she was hungry, but whatever. Anyway, she then had a son born in 1731 and a son born in 1733. Now, her maiden name was Lawrence, Margaret Lawrence. Her sons were John Lawrence and Thomas Lawrence. So that is indicative to me that she did not marry. And in fact, we can find no record of marriage while she was indentured to Tobias Phillips. Family lore has always said that he was the father of her children. We do not know if that was a consensual relationship or not. Certainly, it was under some sort of duress since he essentially owned her at that time. As far as we can tell, we haven't been able to find a death record of any kind, but as far as we can tell, she was deceased by 1739. 1739 is the year that Tobias Phillips wrote out his will. And he accounts for every one of his slaves and other servants, and he does not account for her. And so the assumption is that she was deceased. In fact, there is, again, some family lore that she may have had another child, and both she and the child died in childbirth sometime between 1733 and 1739. Now, in Tobias's will, Thomas, not John, but Thomas is required to work out his mother's indentureship, which is just unbelievable to me because he was 6 years old at the time. Keep that in mind. So he's required to work out the rest of his mother's 14 years of service. And then it's instructed in the will that Tobias's son George is to pay Thomas freedom dues. And so he does, and we have transactional records that he was paid 500 pounds of tobacco as his freedom dues. And then he uses that to purchase land adjacent to George's land. And he then, kind of raises his family, gets married, has children of his own, raises his family in the vicinity of this Phillips family. Now, again, family lore has stated that Margaret Lawrence's children are the children of Tobias Phillips. And so I have for years, and my family before me have been collecting evidence. And finally, this last year, my dad and I sat down. It's my mom's family, but my dad and I worked on it. We sat down and we sorted and filtered through all this evidence using this hypothesis, and were able to strengthen it based on some additional evidence that we were able to discover in some of the paperwork and some of the ways in which people relate to each other, the ways they sell land back and forth. There's all sorts of evidence that was collected. But ultimately, what we were able to discover was with DNA, we were able to discover clear genetic connections between my mom and others in her family who have tested, and Tobias Phillips' family. And because we had done all this other extensive research, we knew that there was no other intermarriage between these two families. So Thomas married somebody from somewhere else, brought her there. They had children. None of their children or grandchildren ever intermarried with the Phillips family. So as far as we can tell, those genetics are coming from Tobias Phillips. And we feel pretty confident now that we have proven this hypothesis. Now, even with that, even with all the evidence we've collected and now this genetic evidence, we are still open to the fact that there could be a new piece of evidence that comes to light that makes the whole thing fall apart. So again, even when you get into this super advanced genealogy with lots of correlation of evidence back in the 1700s, with DNA evidence even, you still have to kind of be open to this fact that there could be new evidence that comes to light. So that is just an example from my own family history. Let me just wrap up today. Hopefully this has been useful. I've shared some specific examples, but the idea was just to kind of get your brain churning on what that means for your own research. And like I said, I would strongly encourage you, especially if you're new, but even if you've been doing this a really long time, because it's kind of a good basics refresher, to write out some of those hypotheses and keep them with you, like stick them on a Post-it and slap it on your computer screen, or write it on a notepad and keep it next to your keyboard, to just kind of keep you focused and thinking about what it is that you're looking for, what it is that you know, what your hypothesis really is. Because when you articulate it, it makes it really clear, oh, this is what I think, and so that's how this is informing the research that I'm doing. And maybe I need to change my hypothesis so that it changes the way that I approach my research. So here's some of my other tips besides writing it down. Just because a record states a thing is true doesn't make it true. And for new people, that might come as a really big shock, but I'll give you a kind of a specific example. So I was doing some research just last night on a project that I'm working on. It was for a woman who was born in 1947, and I found her marriage record from 1967, and it lists her parents' names. And her last name did not match the last name of either of her parents. Now, because I had been doing a whole bunch of research into this family, I recognized who they were right away. They were her maternal grandparents. And I knew that because I had been doing that research. I had been researching the whole family. I also knew that her mother had died in a car crash when she was only 2 years old. So she was raised essentially by her grandparents, and they are listed on her marriage record as her parents. But as I was staring at that record and knowing I was going to be putting this video together today, I thought, what happens if somebody who knows nothing about this family, maybe it's one of the daughters or granddaughters of this woman, is researching, they find this marriage certificate and they say, oh, look, there's her parents. And they plug them into the tree as the parents, and now all of a sudden they're missing an entire generation. They've missed mom, and they'll never go looking for who dad really is because they think they have the parents. And I just thought that is one of the dangers of family history research. Families are messy. Families are messy now. Families were messy 300 years ago. And records, a single record doesn't always tell the truth. And so that is why one of the steps, or the first step of the genealogical proof standard, is conduct a reasonably exhaustive search. Gather as much evidence as you can and research entire families, not just a single individual and a target, parent, child, spouse, because you're more likely to come to correct conclusions if you do that. So just a little tip. The second tip here is to spend as much time disproving your hypothesis as you do proving it. Now that's just another way to say what I've been saying all along, which is just keep yourself open to the fact that there may be new evidence that says this isn't true. For example, if all of a sudden I discovered a death record for Maggie Lawrence, and that death record pointed to the fact that maybe she left a will, and then I find a will and it states the name of her children's father, well, now I have super conflicting evidence to weigh against this other evidence that I've collected. So you just have to stay open to the fact that there could be alternatives to your hypothesis out there. And sometimes I actively try to disprove the conclusions that I've come to. For example, again, last night I was working on the research for this family, and I had a man with a super unique name, and so I found his find a grave, I found his death certificate, I found all this information. Death certificate listed a spouse's name, which led me to a marriage record, and then all of a sudden, something was just not quite. You sometimes get that feeling, you're like, something's not quite right here, I'm not sure what it is. I went back and looked at the death certificate, no parents' names. I went back and looked at the marriage certificate, no parents' names. I went back to a census and did a search in this area of Tennessee for this man with this unique name. Guess what I found? 2 men with this unique name who were about the same age. And I actually was able to then trace the other man, found a marriage record with the names of the parents that I knew was who I was looking for in this particular family. So you have to just be sometimes looking to disprove information through the weeds. Okay, and then finally, and this is just something that I feel really strongly about, and it's something I talk about quite a bit. In fact, I've done an entire video series on just this, the genealogical proof standard. If that's something new to you, please go check out that video series. If it is not something new to you, it's always good to get a refresher, but follow the steps of the genealogical proof standard. One of the things that I have discovered is that when we do that, we make far fewer mistakes. Our tree starts to be big and healthy. We hit fewer brick walls. And when we take DNA tests, that information matches. We don't end up with wildly conflicting information, because when you follow the genealogical proof standard, it is much more likely that you'll be climbing your family tree and not somebody else's. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.